You know what I think we should do? I think we should just save the goodbyes for tomorrow at lunch.
Oh. Okay.
And then tomorrow, I can tell you what a great boss you turned out to be. Best boss I ever had.
After 4 weeks of self-isolation, I have finally managed to successfully binge-watch the entirety of The Office and Parks and Rec. It took a while, but I've gotta say, if you have not seen either of these shows, then you are seriously doing yourself a disfavor. These two are without a doubt some of the best TV shows that I have ever seen. The characters, the comedy, the plot, I absolutely fell in love with these two shows. But in case you couldn't tell, I do strongly prefer one over the other. This is a really weird situation for me. Going into making this video, it was going to be called The Office versus Parks and Rec, where I was going to evaluate the shows as equals and compare and contrast them to find which one that I thought was the best. This is also weird for me because growing up, I watched Parks and Rec first, and I refused to watch The Office for many years because I thought, there's no way that it could ever beat up Parks and Rec. But after I finished The Office and started to rewatch the antics of Leslie Knope, I found myself saying time and time again, Now, that's not to say that Parks and Rec is bad. Far from it. In fact, when put up against a lot of other media that we consume today, it is by all means a fantastic show. But I feel like people have taken it a step further in recent years, going so far as to say that Parks and Rec completely outshines The Office. Which definitely caught me off guard since I never thought of it as a competition, but apparently it is. And a rather active one at that. Surprisingly, the majority of vocal people in this argument seem to be on the side of Parks and Rec. They argue that Parks and Rec perfected what The Office had established and that Parks and Rec was better overall. But if you're a person who's never seen either show, then you probably wouldn't think that at first glance, given that The Office has so many funny and heartwarming moments scattered around YouTube, whereas with Parks and Rec, the only video compilations you ever get advertised are typically Best of Ron Swanson compilations, if any. That, and the show's relevance in memes and countless quotable lines, numerous memorable characters, and relatable settings, overall, The Office just has more going on than Parks and Rec does to me. So without further ado, this is why The Office is better than Parks and Rec. We can't really go in depth with either of these two shows without first addressing the way in which they are filmed and presented to the audience. Camera work is something that most people probably don't even think about when they watch something, which is sad to hear if you're a camera operator, seeing as camera work is everything in film. It helps dictate the atmosphere and mood of the environment that our characters live in and is used for storytelling in many creative ways. In the case of The Office, the camera operators themselves are characters. The Office is presented as a fake, amateur documentary and comes complete with shaky handheld camera movements, character interviews, and references to the camera crew that really help to make the world that our characters live in feel real. Parks and Rec is also presented like a mockumentary, having 2 out of these 3 traits that I brought up earlier. And it comes with a lot of the same presentation that The Office does, while at the same time taking away from what The Office established. Every time that they do a cutaway interview with somebody in Parks and Rec, I can't help but think to myself, who are they supposed to be talking to? They never explain why the show is presented like a mockumentary. It's never established that the shaky hand cams are the result of a camera crew. They never address the fact that they seem to be getting filmed, except for fourth wall breaks that are more targeted at the audience than the camera crew. But no, even then, the fact that the cast acknowledges they're being filmed really takes away from the story at certain times because there's never a storyline involving the camera crew like how there was with The Office. It might sound like I'm nitpicking here, and sure, I might be a little bit, but keep in mind that this is a way bigger issue than it appears to be at first glance. Without a camera, you don't have a show. The camera gives their audience their first impression of a piece of media, so the way in which you present your show is everything. The entire idea behind your show being a mockumentary, at least in theory, is to make everything seem as realistic as possible, like you're just watching everyday, ordinary people doing ordinary, relatable things. And that's the first place where Parks and Rec really drops the ball. Everyone has a different idea for what they consider to be relatable, but I think it's safe to say that a majority of people out there in the world would find the setting of a boring office job far more relatable than that of a government parks department job. Never mind the fact that most people don't even know what a parks department is or does. You take one look at Dunder Mifflin and you can think to yourself, man, thank God I don't work there. And you can relate to the struggle of the main characters just by seeing where they work. Whereas with the Parks Department office, you're just confused. There's nothing wrong with presenting a story in an environment like this, but when you're already trying to establish your setting as something relatable / down to earth, and this is the place that our characters go to work in, it just continues to cut off the link that the viewers have to the show. And I feel like the writers on Parks and Rec realized that no one really cared about the Parks Department office that much, because after a certain point in the series, they just kind of stopped going there. Its showcases become more and more limited until eventually we don't see it at all, and in exchange we see several different locations that the cast visits regularly, in the town of Pawnee essentially becoming the setting. This can make the show exciting to look at times, but overall feel cluttered, as we the viewers don't really have a concrete place to call back to anymore. Compare this to The Office, where everything revolved around Dunder Mifflin, and any story that took place outside of work was treated like how it would feel for somebody stuck in a boring office job. Like an event. Like something to be treasured. Seeing the cast of The Office go on a trip outside of work gives the audience the same feeling that we got when we were kids and our teachers told us that we were going out on a field trip. Whenever our characters have to leave the office, it's always for a special reason that drives the plot forward. With Parks and Rec, they unfortunately overuse these settings all the time until eventually the audience becomes numb to them. However, Parks and Rec does utilize a lot more interesting locations than The Office, and at the end of the day, I do have to commend them for taking the audience to so many interesting and memorable locations. It's just that, unfortunately for Parks and Rec, it can be really hard to pull off a down-to-earth, relatable premise and a host of exotic and luxurious settings. Most of the time, you've got to stick with one or the other, or else you run the risk of everywhere the characters go feeling the same. The plot is the only place I could really see someone making an argument for Parks and Rec being better than The Office, but I think that this part comes more so down to the viewer's personal taste than the overall quality of the shows. Both shows take a very different approach to how they handle their main stories, and both of them are paced very differently. Parks and Rec typically has small stories that are contained within 1 or 2 episodes that are usually just for comedic effect, while meanwhile each season is dedicated to 1 or 2 long story arcs that Leslie is the main character for. The Office does long story arcs too, like with the Michael Scott Paper Company, Jim's Sports Business, and Oscar with the Senator, but 90% of the time The Office disregards long story arcs in favor of keeping the stories tied down to just a single episode. Again, which way of storytelling that you think is better comes down to personal preference. But I personally prefer The Office, as making the stories take place within a single episode gives the audience more of a chance to see close, personal character growth and get to experience more intimate stories that make us grow more attached to the characters. The first time that I ever noticed this was when I watched The Office Olympics. In this episode, we have 2 stories happening at the same time. One where Jim leads the office workers through a series of office-themed Olympic Games, and another where Michael is trying to work up the nerve to buy a condo. When Michael is depressed after having given in and bought the condo, Jim and Pam host a closing ceremony for their games, in which Michael, despite having technically lost, is given a first-place medal by his employees. It's short, sweet, to the point, and it shows just how boring and soul-crushing the everyday life of an adult can be when you don't allow yourself to have fun. The Office is full of little stories like this that show how the cast makes the most out of their everyday lives at Dunder Mifflin. I understand why Parks and Rec does the opposite and plays out their stories long term, since just like the government in real life, things typically take a long time to play out. But this has the unfortunate side effect of disappointing the audience when a story doesn't play out very well. You see, with The Office, if one story is stupid and boring, it's usually just for that or 2 episodes. But when something is stupid in Parks and Rec, it takes multiple episodes to play out and leaves a bigger bad taste in my mouth, since there was always so much buildup in the show's plot. A good example of this is when after a season and a half of Leslie's city councilwoman arc, we see her removed from that position. For absolutely no reason. None. One day out of the blue, a group of townsfolk decide that they don't like all the positive changes that Leslie has been doing for Pawnee, and as a result, start a long campaign to have her removed from office. And they win. I'll talk about how annoying it is that these characters are stupid later in the video, but plot first. From a writing perspective, this is just lazy. To have so many episodes of progress completely thrown out of the window because a group of background characters with no personality just decide, we don't like her. Watching this play out, I genuinely felt mad. I felt cheated. And I felt like the show had wasted my time by getting me so invested into this storyline. I'm not saying that removing Leslie from her job was bad. I'm saying the way in which they did it was bad. All they had to do was give a legitimate reason for why Leslie got fired from the city council. Maybe she got in a fight with a girl from Eagleton during the merger, or maybe something she did in the past is brought up to the public and it makes her not look professional anymore. I don't know. Anything would have been better than just, you don't like her, goodbye. I'm not trying to hate on Parks and Rec here, and if that's what it sounds like, then I apologize. That's not my intention. The point that I'm trying to make here is that when something is stupid in Parks and Rec, it has a much greater chance of affecting the show long term than The Office does, given that the episodes are short stories and usually not long arcs. I understand why these shows have fundamentally different pacings, but when comparing them both, I just feel like the benefits of The Office's story structure greatly outweigh those of Parks and Rec. By sticking so closely to the day-by-day story structure, they kind of make the audience feel just like the employees of Dunder Mifflin, just taking it one day at a time. Parks and Rec has some amazing stories in their arsenal, but due to the show being locked onto Leslie for more than half the running time, it feels like they miss out on tackling a lot of subject matter that The Office gets to handle on a regular basis. The Office has dealt with suicide, depression, poverty, homophobia, midlife crisis, abusive relationships, racism, sexual harassment, addiction, death, and so much more not listed here, all due to the fact that because of the pacing of the show's plot, we are not tied down to any one character at all times, and can freely hop back and forth between every office worker whenever the plot needs to. Michael might be the most memorable character, but he's not the main character. I'd argue that everyone in The Office is the main character because collectively they are supposed to represent every side to a person working in an office environment. They're all supposed to be relatable, and the shenanigans that they get involved in are all plausible situations that we, the audience, could see ourselves getting into. I hear a lot of people make the argument that Parks and Rec ended better and on its own terms, while The Office died off slowly and horribly in the last 2 seasons. And to that idea, I would agree. And strongly disagree. Did The Office take a sharp decline after Michael left The Office? Yeah, of course. He was the anchor to the show, and Steve Carell as Michael Scott is, in my opinion, irreplaceable. Except for maybe Bob Odenkirk, but whatever. The Office got really bad once Will Ferrell became the new boss, but I attribute this to just being a poor casting choice. Will Ferrell is the type of actor that soaks up all the spotlight and demands the audience's attention, so coming into an 8-season-long TV series was probably not the best place to introduce him as a character, given that there was already several other plotlines being developed at the same time. But after the 3 episodes that Will Ferrell is in, I feel like the show picked right back up in a really good place, with Robert California and Andy becoming the new leadership around The Office. It wasn't the same as with Michael, but I never once felt like I was watching a, quote, dying show, like so many people claim The Office felt like in the last seasons. As a matter of fact, the final 2 seasons have some of my favorite moments in all of The Office as a whole.
Dwight and me pretend to be a hipster to create hype, and it's working. There's already people camped out behind me.
The writing and plot definitely declined, I'm not denying that, and believe me, nobody was more upset to see the way that things turned out for Andy than me. Andy was my favorite character, and the writers really did him dirty in the final few episodes. But I'm sorry, 3 bad episodes with Will Ferrell and a bad character arc with Andy are not enough for me to just disregard the finale of The Office to me. I'll admit that Parks and Rec's finale was more tightly written and concluded more satisfying than The Office did. But not without a few hiccups on their part either. A lot of the storyline feels really rushed to me, and the use of the futuristic technology really takes me even further out of the whole "it's a mockumentary" idea of the show. But all in all, this argument that Parks and Rec ended better than The Office did is just not as true as people make it out to be. Because while the writing might be tighter for Parks and Rec, the ace up the sleeve for The Office is the fact that 95% of the situations they end up in are all realistic things that we could all, and if you do work in an environment like Dunder Mifflin, probably have imagined happening. Parks and Rec was already a somewhat hard plot to relate to just based on the premise alone. But in the last season, they just completely strip away all the relatability from the show and really stretch how far they can take the realistic mockumentary idea. A compelling plot will only get you so far if the characters themselves are not likable. So how do both of these shows fare in this department? Well, first off, let me just start by saying that I like every main character on Parks and Rec, just like I do with The Office. But remember earlier when I said it was interesting that you only see Ron Swanson compilations for Parks and Rec? Yeah, we're gonna talk about that. I'm not even gonna try to sugarcoat this part. The cast of Parks and Rec don't feel like real people. I love them, but I can't relate to any of them. They might have certain quirks that only they possess. They might be very talented comedians in real life and as a result say funny things. But as characters in the show, literally the only relatable character to me and a lot of other people out there is Ron Swanson. I also like Ben, but it's mostly Ron Swanson. I think most people would agree that Ron Swanson is the saving grace of Parks and Rec that single-handedly gives the show what feels like more than half of the most memorable moments in its entirety. Every word out of this guy's mouth is just comedy gold.
Do you have any history of mental illness in your family?
I have an uncle who does yoga.
Allergies?
Cowardice and weak-willed men. And hazelnuts.
Sexual history?
Epic and private.
Ron stands out as the only relatable person in the show to me, partially because of the show's main character, Leslie. I love Leslie. She's a great role model and she's a funny character. But let's be honest, she's a pro-government, hyperactive, extrovertive, optimistic, feminist workaholic. I've seen more relatable pieces of toast. There's nothing wrong with being any of these things, but 90% of the reason I watched Parks and Rec was because I loved Ron Swanson so much. And 90% of the reason I loved him so much was because I always needed a breather from the show's main character. But Klooch, what about The Office? Michael's an annoying character too, you might be saying. And yeah, sure, he's a little cringy. But 1, the show is not locked onto, nor does it revolve around only him 24/7. And 2, he might be annoying, but he's annoying in a relatable way. Everything that Michael does in the show stems from his fear of being alone and makes the audience sympathize with him every time that he makes a fool out of himself, since we know that he's not doing it to be an asshole, he just wants attention. Meanwhile, everything that Leslie does stems from her love of government. Yeah, I can't relate. Excluding Will Ferrell, The Office doesn't really have any deadweight characters. Every main character in the series has a role on the show, and they fulfill their role well. Most of the Parks and Rec cast are okay, but can somebody please tell me, what is Donna's job? Seriously, wait a minute, what is Donna's job? Office manager. What? To be fair though, I do think she's funny and she's not that bad of a character. No. That honor goes to Ann Perkins, who also played Karen in The Office for a little bit. Rashida Jones, man. I love this actress. But she really got dealt a bad hand with these two shows. Less so in The Office since they get rid of her after her story's done. But man, does she really have nothing going on for her in Parks and Rec. She starts off strong via being the catalyst that sets off the entire show in the first place, and soon after becomes Leslie's best friend. But as time goes on, she is eventually downgraded to just that, Leslie's best friend, and nothing much more than that. Which in and of itself isn't terrible. I wouldn't have a problem with her becoming the normal, generic voice of reason on the show that says what the audience is thinking. But these writers, man, they just keep giving her terrible lines.
I relish your wit.
Well, I salsa your face.
Throughout the entire show, she just keeps getting extremely awkward one-liners over and over again, up until the point that I was kinda happy when she left the show in season 7. I hear a lot of people out there calling Anne the Jim of Parks and Rec, often being the one who looks at the camera and throughout the whole show appears to be the most normal one in the cast. But that can't be the case because she has absolutely no role in the show's plot after the first 2 seasons and does nothing up until she decides that she wants to have a baby, and then immediately afterwards leaves the show. And then there's Mark Brandanowitz, who I honestly forgot existed up until writing this portion of the script, and then I couldn't remember his name, so I had to Google it. And then I couldn't remember what he did in the show, so I had to rewatch the first half of season 1 just so that I could write this section on him. And after all of that, I have nothing to say about him. That's how much this character did for the show, and that's not me exaggerating. Anne was annoying and didn't contribute much to the plot, but at least she had a somewhat role among the cast by being the voice of reason. But this lump of wood literally contributed nothing to the show, other than being Leslie's love interest for the first season, and yeah, that's it, actually. I don't even know how to end this section. While we're on the topic of characters, I'd like to talk about the show's villains. Both shows have their fair share of antagonists, and both of them do this department on the show very well, by creating some extremely memorable, funny villains. Obviously, The Office's take on their antagonists is more realistic than Parks and Rec. We all know this. Rather than make the villain down to earth, Parks and Rec prioritizes telling as many jokes as possible and making their villains memorable. So rather than repeat my Office is more realistic argument again, I'll give Parks and Rec a win in this department simply because I love Tammy, Jan, and all the villains of Parks and Rec so much. I love The Office villains too, for their accurate portrayals of abusive bosses, corrupt CEOs, and awkward beta males in the work environment. But even I can't deny that someone like Gabe is never going to stand out as much as a character like Tammy too. But while we're on the topic of villains, I'd like to talk about a person called Jerry Gergich. Jerry, you might ask, but he's not a villain, Klooch. And you're right, he is not. So can somebody please tell me why literally everyone on Parks and Rec hates him? This was without a doubt the most consistently infuriating aspect of Parks and Rec for me to watch, and really soured the mood whenever they would pick on him. And I'm not against having a character that everyone picks on. In The Office, almost everyone picks on Toby. But outside of Michael, it never comes off as malicious or mean from anyone. And even when it does come off as mean from Michael, Michael's an idiot. Who cares what he thinks? Plus, it makes sense given that being an HR rep, he stands for everything that Michael hates. Not to mention that they do make him out to be a bit of a creep for Pam, as well as an annoying guy in general, so there's some reason to it. So what is Jerry's crime to mankind? He's clumsy. Sometimes. My point is, Toby's abuse never comes off half as mean-spirited as that of Jerry on Parks and Rec. Similarly to The Office, if it was just 1 or 2 characters, say Tom and April, who were mean to him, then I wouldn't have a problem because April already hates everyone and Tom is afraid of turning into Jerry. The fact that everyone picks on Jerry hurts the show even more than it would normally when you consider that characters like Leslie, Andy, and especially the beacon of positivity that is Chris Traeger end up having to break their happy, loving characters over and over for the simple act of keeping the running gag going. Maybe there's some people out there who think how Jerry is treated is funny, and if that's the case, then by all means like what you like, I can't stop you. But for me personally, at times I couldn't help but feel like the cast members themselves became the villains whenever it involved dealing with Jerry. Everything that I've talked about up until this point all comes down to a trend that I'm sure you guys have picked up on by now. The Office is an easier show to relate to. Nearly every aspect about the show is structured to make you feel like you're really there experiencing the monotony of an everyday office environment, and subsequently experiencing the antics the Dunder Mifflin crew goes to get out of their work. I feel such a strong attachment to each of these characters, not just because they stand out as funny and unique individuals, but they're funny, unique individuals in an environment that wouldn't usually produce such vibrant characters. Whenever we see someone on the show who doesn't work at Dunder Mifflin, they're always looking down upon the cast like they're immature kids. We are reminded time and time again throughout The Office's run that the cast members are special. Compare this to Parks and Rec, where instead of just the main cast being the unusual quirky ones, everyone else in the show is made out to be some kind of weird quirky stereotype, whereas the main cast is portrayed as the normal ones, despite them not being normal. To me, the whole point of The Office is meant to be a bait and switch. The Office to me is a flower, blooming amidst a sea of decaying concrete. When I see The Office, I see hope that the human spirit will always find a way to break free from the monotony of everyday life to fulfill its dreams. I see a testament to all those who find themselves working dead-end jobs that there is hope, and above all else, I see one of the greatest TV shows to ever be made.